Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third event in this year's Tecnoglass lecture series. I'm Joel Lemire, coordinator of the series and an assistant professor here in the University of Miami School of Architecture. I have to say right at the outset that today's speakers, Teddy Cruz and FONNA FORMAN, were the only figures I sort of already had in mind as I was developing this year's theme. So I'll come back to my enthusiasm about that in a minute. First, I need to thank Tecnoglass for their support. The Tecnoglass lecture series has enabled the School of Architecture to invite and feature the very best architectural practitioners, thinkers, and visionaries from all over the world, to bring them here in person, or in this case, virtually, ask them to share their work and enable our faculty and students to engage them directly. The series gives us access to this wealth of architectural knowledge and is made possible only through the generosity of Tecnoglass. So thank you to them. One small piece of housekeeping for those of you who are professionals before we dive in. As you may know, the AIA offers continuing education credits for these events. In particular, I think this one is the coveted health, safety, welfare credit. So if you're interested in receiving those credits, please email Stephen Fett at sfett@miami.edu. I think somebody hopefully will paste that into the Zoom chat as well for those of you attending remotely. All right, so to return to the heart of the matter, Teddy Cruz and FONNA FORMAN. In a recent article for log number 52, FONNA and Teddy reflect on our recent loss of the great Michael Sorkin, remembering him as someone who, quote, believed architects can be political agents, end quote. And more specifically, they describe his position on public space as, quote, worried that identitarian entrenchment fragmented the public into multiple publics vying for recognition, which undermine collective resistance to the forces of privatization encroaching into our public spaces, end quote. So FONNA and Teddy are describing a failure that they are themselves determined not to repeat. Namely, our failure to properly frame contemporary problems in ways that allow us to collectively work toward a larger public good. Yet this pervasive condition remains. We might call it neoliberalism, which certainly guides our urbanism and new urbanisms. And perhaps more menacingly still, we see it also at the heart of our academic institutions, where, as Timothy Shank puts it in his latest issue of Dissent magazine, quote, ranks of the tenured dwindle, adjunctification marches onward, and graduate students ask what they're supposed to do next, end quote. In short, we are desperately short on collectivity on many fronts. The question of what can be done to gather collective power and produce collective public good is the subtext of this semester's lecture series theme, opting in. Faced with many parallel crises, accelerating climate change, rampant economic inequities, structural oppression by race and gender, intensifying refugee movement and militarized borders, among others, we simply cannot accept conventional disciplinary bounds. We have to imagine an expanded version of practice, not individual space building practices with only enough power to succeed in current systems, but collective buildings practices with power to truly change those systems. The studio Teddy Cruz y FONNA FORMAN is the definitive example of a practice that confronts these issues relentlessly and honestly. They center community and collectivity. They reject conventional disciplinary bounds, even from their founding. FONNA FORMAN being a professor of political theory, and Teddy Cruz being an accomplished architect and professor of public culture and urbanism, both at UC San Diego. Their distinctions and accolades are many, including worldwide exhibitions and a couple of upcoming monographs, among many other publications. But kind of in the spirit of emphasizing the collective and the knowledge, I'm gonna keep that part of the introduction short. We also will be joined by two panelists after the presentation today, who I'd like to introduce, Jermaine Barnes and Cynthia Gennady, both faculty here at University of Miami School of Architecture, who hopefully have a couple of probing questions to include later in the day. So on behalf of the School of Architecture and University of Miami and Tecnoglass, please join me in welcoming FONNA FORMAN and Teddy Cruz. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Joel, for that wonderful, wonderful and very generous introduction. We're glad that you saw that piece in the log. It was very meaningful for us. Losing Michael was tragic over these last couple of years. So we're excited to be here with you, to discuss our research-based practice embedded at the San Diego-Tijuana border. We really see this zone as a microcosm of all of the injustices and indignities experienced by vulnerable people across the globe. Political violence, climate disruption, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, border building everywhere, deepening inequality, and the steady decay of public thinking. We live and work a few miles from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego-Tijuana has become a lightning rod for American nativism. And although the news cameras are gone, tens of thousands of Central American and now Haitian migrants wait at the wall for asylum that never comes, reviled by the Mexican public as a nuisance, an infestation, or else they sit in US detention centers as tools of deterrence, until recently separated forcibly from their children and exposed to a raging pandemic. It's been particularly devastating in recent years to witness the emotional impact on children, their fear, and the inevitable psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. Hopefully, there's relief on the horizon, but the prospect of more border porosity in the coming period is drawing even more people north. With misinformation circulating on social media, conditions are intensifying here every day. And climate change will inevitably accelerate these flows in the years to come. A recent United Nations survey found that 72% of arriving migrants at our southern border are agricultural workers, and that agricultural instability was a major factor in their decision to walk north. So global injustice is an intensely local experience here. Now, against these local atrocities, border communities and activists on both sides of the wall continue to confront and productively circumvent power. Some of this contestation is about sanctuary and protecting people targeted by the state. Some of it is working through the courts, the detention centers, and other institutions of power to advocate for people ensnared in the net of political violence. Some of it takes the shape of bottom-up civic agency that exposes and counters unjust power, confronts political narratives, and transgresses boundaries. Much of it arises informally through everyday collective practices of adaptation and resilience in conditions of scarcity and danger. Over the years, Teddy and I have accompanied some of these bottom-up emancipatory transgressions and eruptions of democratic will in close partnership with agencies at the front lines. In recent years, these struggles have also attracted artists and cultural producers from around the world to engage in acts of performative protest. But we, as a practice, have been mostly critical of this uptick in ephemeral cultural action that sort of dips in and out of the conflict. It tends to be extractive in its process, and the impact on public consciousness is fleeting as the Instagram posts that it generates. What happens the day after the happening? Instead, we've been arguing for a longer view of resistance, a more systemic approach to the drivers of injustice, and more strategic thinking about cultural, institutional, and spatial transformation in the border region. These commitments have culminated in a project that we'd like to share with you today, the UCSD Community Station, a network of public spaces located in vulnerable neighborhoods across the border region, where universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources and collaborate on research, dialogue, cultural and educational activities, and urban design build projects in the city. The community stations are the sort of field-based social engagement arm of our research-based design lab inside the university. So here we are with our team, some of our community partners in Tijuana, just before COVID-19 hit. We have several core commitments that comprise what we call a community stations model, which we think is highly replicable for universities everywhere. I will introduce these commitments. Teddy will then take you on a tour of the UCSD Community Stations sites, and then I will conclude with a few words about our programming at the sites and how it links our border context here with sites of conflict across the world. So to begin, we localize the global. We've all resisted the idea that global justice is something that happens out there somewhere in the world. Living and working where we do, we don't need to send our students far away to learn about territorial conflict, migration, poverty, climate justice. We live minutes away from an international border in crisis, and this enables an amazing proximity between campus and field, between theory and practice, what we like to think of as a critical proximity. Of course, going local here means recognizing ourselves as a region, a site of interdependence. Despite the wall and the ugly political rhetoric that's designed to divide us, we are a binational ecology of flows and circulation, and our future is intertwined. Air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, love. These things don't stop at walls. We build trust bridges, long-term partnerships between our university and border communities. We're not like sort of flaky university programs that come and go, diagnosing problems, extracting data, and then disappearing. We don't disappear. We are there for the long haul. Relatedly, we decolonize knowledge. We are keenly attuned to power dynamics. Powerful universities arrive in communities and are critical of both extractive research methods and humanitarian problem-solving missions. We don't do applied research, and we don't do charity. We are not a service learning program. Academic culture is filled with vertical assumptions that we know more, that we are trained to solve the world's problems if only they would listen to us. We are committed to horizontal practices of co-production, engaging communities as partners with knowledges and agency. Everyone contributes, everyone learns, and we do things together in the border region that no one can do alone. Along these lines, universities too often take for granted the resources that communities invest when they work with us: time, space, social capital, labor, knowledge. As a matter of epistemic justice and labor equity, these contributions need to be validated and compensated. So we're curating two-way flows, inside out and outside in, unsiloing our campus and inviting activists and community leaders into campus to teach with us, ultimately thinking outside the box, literally, what it means for a university to commit to diversity, cultivating skills of cultural sensitivity, empathy, and awesome respect. These are skills that are best learned in situ. Today's challenges demand intersectionality. It's the buzzword of the moment, but everything we do on migration, climate change, environment, health, labor, education, urbanization, all of it is refracted through the lens of social transformation. And in this sense, everything we do is cultural. For us, really, it's about changing hearts and minds, tackling inequality by increasing public knowledge about the roots and springs of injustice, and growing connected, civically engaged border communities capable of collective action, advocacy, and productive contestation. Ultimately here, we are committed to building a cross-border citizenship culture. It's a sense of belonging that is not defined by the nation state or the documents that you carry in your pocket, but by the shared interests and aspirations among people who inhabit a violently and artificially disrupted civic space. Those who benefit from narratives of mistrust prefer that we remain a fragmented public, that the idea of citizenship divides us rather than unites us. We seek to inspire more inclusive imaginaries of coexistence and cross-border citizenship in this contested territory. Our cultural aspirations are inspired by Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal, and a 20th century lineage of Latin American civic experimentation and urban pedagogy. In contexts of dramatic violence and social fragmentation, cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, and Bogota and Medellin, Colombia, sought to heal the wounds of history and mobilize a cohesive civic identity through participatory cultural action. The way Antanas Mockus in Bogota, for example, used street minds, urban games, and theatrical public disruptions to transform urban norms from the bottom up. Or the way Medellin, Colombia, transformed urban remainders and forgotten zones into vibrant civic spaces that prioritized access and education. Like Medellin's now legendary library parks, our community stations represent a model of urban co-development between public universities and community organizations. To fight gentrification of border neighborhoods, each station is designed, funded, built, programmed, and maintained collaboratively between the campus and the community. Finally, we reject conventional strategies of urban beautification and innovation that turn our public spaces into sites of leisure and consumption. We question the agenda of the creative class and their pop-ups, which too often accelerate gentrification, appropriate arts and culture for private ends, and become an apology for the absence of a more substantial public investment in the city. We believe public space must become civicized. It's a beautiful concept from James Tully, a site of dialogue and contestation infused with resources and tools to increase public knowledge and community capacity for political environmental action. Now, a tour of our UCSD community stations and just a hint about what happens in these spaces.
So for us, urban justice is a distributive concept requiring not only the redistribution of resources, but also the redistribution of knowledges. We designed this reciprocal knowledge infrastructure as both a collaborative education platform and a model of shared urban intervention. We claimed that the economic and programmatic power of our public university could be leveraged for communities to develop their own public spaces and social housing. As a distributed system of public spaces transgressing the wall, the community stations spatialize social justice, mobilizing cross-border citizenship through cultural action. With our community partners, we have co-developed 4 community stations, 2 in San Diego, 2 in Tijuana. We'll take you from north to south. The UCSD Earth Lab Community Station is a partnership with Groundwork San Diego, an environmental justice nonprofit located in the low-income, primarily Black and Latinx neighborhood of Encanto, a community characterized by high unemployment, low educational attainment, food insecurity, and cyclical poverty. The station occupies a 4-acre vacant parcel owned by the San Diego Unified School District, who granted access to the parcel to our partnership to increase educational capacity for the 8 public schools within walking distance of the site. The goal was to promote circulations between traditional classroom-based learning and outdoor experiential learning. This access to municipal land gave us leverage to assemble a unique cross-sector collaboration between a major research university, a local school district, and a grassroots organization to co-develop public space, placing education at the center of community development. So before COVID-19 hit, 3,000 kids and their families circulated through the Earth Lab each year. And during the current transition, it continues to operate as an outdoor, socially distanced classroom. Recently, the school district committed capital monies towards a more refined physical resolution of the site for what has been so far a largely informal effort, while UCSD, our university, will invest in sustainable educational programming, research, and management in collaboration with our community partners, Groundwork San Diego, who will steward community participation. Pedagogic zones at the site will be focused on habitat restoration through energy, water, food, community programs, all wrapped by indigenous Kumeyaay knowledges and environmental practices. Ultimately, the UCSD Earth Lab Community Station will perform as an open-air climate action park designed for environmental education and climate justice. The district has also committed school bond funding for a new climate action design building to anchor the site and as a pilot for post-COVID porosity in classroom design. This station will break ground in 2022. Moving south, the UCSD Casa Community Station is a partnership with the nonprofit Casa Familiar, a 30-year-old community-based social service organization. It is located in the border neighborhood of San Isidro, the site of the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere. The community is 90% Latinx and has one of the highest unemployment rates, lowest median household income, and worst air quality in San Diego County. The heart of this community station is a beloved historic church that sat for decades in disrepair, and which we were able to rescue through this project with our partners. During construction, the building had to be lifted for installing new foundations. During the times of so much political violence inflicted on this border community, the surreal image of the church levitating with Tijuana's informal settlements in the distance inspired a sense of hope for the local residents. With the adaptive reuse of this historic building as a catalyst, we designed the UCSD Casa Community Station as a double project. A parcel-size social infrastructure made of spaces for cultural and economic activity is flanked by affordable housing. The organizational design of the parcel through a system of linear strips with a variety of small-scale buildings performing different roles was also a deliberate strategy to mobilize diverse financial streams to fund the different building typologies. Leveraging programmatic investments by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to support the educational, cultural, and research programming between the university and the community, Casa Familiar, our community partners, and UCSD secured capital investments by the Park Foundation and Our Place America to build the social service infrastructure. These investments enable Casa Familiar to qualify for a $9 million new market tax credit development package facilitated by the local municipality. So effectively, what we're trying to say here is that Casa Familiar, our grassroots organization partners, has become an alternative developer of affordable housing for its own community of San Isidro, and public space was a detonator. We renovated the historic church into a community theater with an outdoor stage, and this performance space is flanked on one side by a series of small accessory buildings for Casa Familiar's social programming, and on the other side by an open-air classroom pavilion. This social, education, and cultural infrastructure anchors 10 units of affordable housing at both ends of the parcel, all mediated by pedestrian walkways. We never imagined that this choreography of indoor and outdoor spaces would become a community asset during a global pandemic. Ultimately, the project advances a reproducible prototype for a small-scale development in low-income neighborhoods, where small buildings collaborate to transform small lots into social housing infrastructures. We completed construction of this station in February, just before COVID-19 hit, and the residents moved in. It's all locked down now, but it is a site built for social proximity, and we are incrementally opening up the spaces so that we can return with full-on programming co-curated with our community partners. What is important to say here is that affordable housing takes on a different meaning when it is deliberately threaded into spaces for social programming, summoning residents to participate in the development of local economy and local production, synergizing spaces, programs, resources, and people. This is an integrated social spatial system that is programmed between university and community. So let's imagine a small coalition of local artists, promotoras, activists, and neighborhood youth collaborating with university curators, theater scriptwriters, and visual artists who come together periodically to co-produce a play that explores an urgent issue facing the community, enacted by local youth in the community theater. These artistic productions are rooted in neighborhood stories and become bottom-up evidentiary material to increase public knowledge and public policy transformation. Before moving across the border, allow me to pause for a moment to summarize a couple of concepts and share how these processes behind our two San Diego-based stations exemplify several core commitments or building blocks in our practice. In conditions of poverty, housing needs to be embedded in an infrastructure of social, economic, and cultural support. In other words, we must rethink affordable housing from autonomous units into relational social systems. Housing must be public infrastructure. Density should not be measured as an abstract and stupid number of objects or people per area. Density must be understood instead as the intensity of social and economic exchanges per area. Migrant neighborhoods have taught us that these exchanges, mobilized by bottom-up urbanization, is the DNA for democratizing the city into more inclusive and plural environments. Zoning must stop being punitive, preventing socialization. Instead, it should be conceptualized as a generative tool that anticipates, stimulates, and organizes social and economic activity in neighborhoods. The developer's pro forma is architecture's financial plastic. Inside the mathematics of this spreadsheet, our services as architects amounts to 15% of a project's construction costs. This undercapitalized asset can be mobilized as collateral for development. Nothing should prevent us as architects from becoming developers of our own projects, and by association, nothing should prevent communities from doing the same. In other words, the sweat equity of architects, cultural producers, and community leaders, the economic equity of public universities, and municipal protocols for accessing public parcels, all of that can be bundled, aggregated to enable communities to develop their own neighborhoods. This truly has been our story. So moving now across the border, our two community stations in Tijuana are located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement adjacent to the border wall. I will take a couple of moments really to describe this incredible context. This location, it is an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyons clash with the border wall before spilling northbound into an environmentally protected estuary or wetland in San Diego, which is now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between natural and jurisdictional systems and between ecological and political priorities is profound. As we zoom in further, we've witnessed a collision between the estuary and the US, the border wall, and the informality of Laureles Canyon, which is home to 92,000 people. This aerial video shows Laureles Canyon and the precarious condition of the informal settlement that has sprawled on the slopes. This site sits 30 minutes away from our campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and extreme poverty in our region. Laureles Canyon is impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding, and landslides, and all of this is exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change. Because Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure to mitigate these impacts, much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows downstream, ending in the estuary in San Diego, contaminating this bioregional and ultimately really a shared binational asset. Here, the border wall truly is an artifact of environmental insecurity. So these impacts have intensified in recent years because of a profound lack of collaboration between San Diego and Tijuana to manage these cross-border flows. In the last decades, 70% of the lands in Laureles Canyon have been lost to irregular urban growth. We have been identifying and bundling unsquatted lands in the settlement that are still environmentally rescuable to shape an archipelago of conservation. We are advancing an ambitious regional project called the Cross-Border Commons, an environmental conservation initiative that links the estuary in the US with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the wall and protects the environmental systems shared between these two border cities. With our Tijuana partners, we are co-curating a coalition of state and municipal agencies, grassroots organizations, and universities on both sides of the wall. And we are now negotiating with the municipality in Tijuana to gain access to the remaining public lands inside the informal settlement. Another important contextual note before I introduce you to the Tijuana stations is that this canyon, this informal settlement of Laureles, has also been the site where we have advanced our research on informal urbanization. As we have written about over the many years, the informal settlements in Tijuana are built with urban waste from San Diego, recycling architectural parts to construct habitation and infrastructure. We have learned a great deal from these incremental building practices as people construct their own shelter in layers over time. In a case study we documented before, a metal frame, for example, appeared from one day to another. In a couple of months, recycled materials from San Diego began to thread the spaces, and in the next weeks, a full-on informal house emerged. We have also taken note that multinational maquiladoras surrounding these informal settlements typically benefit from easy access to cheap labor in these informal settlements. Over the years, we have experimented with factory-made material systems to structurally mediate the recycling of waste. Because Tijuana is a city of multinational factories that prey on cheap labor, we have proposed an ethical loop where factories must invest in emergency housing. Here we are inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquiladora that produces lightweight metal shelving systems for global export, adapting its prefabricated systems into structural scaffolds as armatures for informal housing. We designed a catalog with the factory engineers to test a variety of prototypes and configurations. The first Mecalux typology is shown here with adapted recycled urban waste from San Diego, illustrating how top-down institutional resources must support the bottom-up creative intelligence of informal urbanization. A couple of years ago, we built the first example. For us, being inside the factory, redirecting its material systems and profits to sites of emergency was an important milestone in our research-based practice. We then worked with our community partners to build early applications to demonstrate to the community the adaptability of the system, such as this small bus stop to shelter Laureles workers from the sun. Ultimately, it was important to introduce you briefly to these contextual processes because our two community stations in Tijuana operate within this rich ecology of social, environmental, economic, and material relationships and partners. Now to the stations themselves. The UCSD Alacran community station is located in the most rugged, precarious, and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesus, a religious organization led by activist pastor economist Gustavo Banda and pastor psychologist Zaida Guillen. With limited resources, they began construction of a refugee camp to provide shelter, food, and basic services to hundreds of Haitian and Central American refugees while they navigate unjust asylum processes in the US and Mexico. And with the help of skilled migrants, they began building their own emergency housing. So we have now established a long-term partnership to co-develop a new community station here to increase refugee housing capacity. We are accelerating production of Mecalux frames to install them on vernacular post and beam concrete systems into housing infrastructures. The housing scaffolds will be built first, leaving the interiors as planned open systems, equipped with utilities to support incremental live-work configurations. These envelopes are the seeds for an evolving sanctuary neighborhood to be infilled through time by the migrant community itself. In other words, we see migrant housing as a mechanism for generating jobs. To sustain the construction process over time, we are designing a sanctuary economy. We embed refugee housing in spaces of fabrication, training, small-scale development. And with the support of the Park Foundation, we have assembled a community-owned business, the Little Haiti Construction Company, with a tool library, wood and metal machines, and a couple of trucks and tractors. The migrant community will complete construction of this site and remain operational for future construction jobs across the entire informal settlement. The UCSD Alacran Community Station began construction last summer with seed capital provided by New York-based philanthropist Robert Rubin and Stefan Samuel, whose collaboration on this project expands their commitment to the prefabricated social housing logics of post-war French architect Jean Prouvé. So now finally to our UCSD Divina Community Station. This station is a partnership with Colonos de la Divina Providencia, a Tijuana nonprofit that is rooted in the community of Divina. The nonprofit facilitates a variety of social services, including meals for youth, senior services, medical assistance, and environmental awareness. Using Mechalux parts, the station takes the shape of a flexible scaffold to accommodate a variety of informal programs, including informal markets, cultural events, and a series of multi-level spaces to accommodate a small high school, all curated between our university and our partners, our community partners. At the Divina Station, we work with students and community leaders and researchers on social protection from landslides, floods, and estuary health beyond the wall. We lead educational programming through which young people understand zones of vulnerability in their own neighborhoods, emphasizing ecological conservation of species and habitat restoration. It's never too early to begin. We have committed to elevating children here as the cross-border citizens of the future. Our two Tijuana-based stations have also advanced important building blocks for our architectural and research practice, two in particular. For us, the informal is not just an aesthetic category, but a praxis, a dynamic set of functional urban operations from below that counter and transgress the imposition of top-down political power and exclusionary economic models. Hospitality is the first gesture when the immigrant arrives, an essential charitable opening, a first step in creating a more welcoming society. But as needs become more complex over time, charity is not the appropriate model for building an inclusive society. We need to move from hospitality to inclusion. Thinking beyond shelter is the foundation for rethinking refugee camps everywhere, from places of short-term habitation and service provision to durable infrastructures for inclusion. In other words, migrant shelters can be agile for negotiating both transition and rootedness, the ephemeral and the permanent.
So these are the 4 UCSD community stations. There's so much more to say about them, about our amazing partners and what we do together in these spaces. While the stations focus on different issues, reflecting the priorities of each community, they are all richly curated for dialogue, collaborative research, urban pedagogy, participatory design build, and cultural production. They all aspire to increasing public knowledge, challenging divisive political narratives, fostering solidarity and collective action, and advancing strategies to counter exploitation, dispossession, deportation, and environmental calamity. These activities often invite encounters with formal institutions of power that govern the border zone. Sometimes these meetings facilitate mutual recognition and cooperation, and sometimes they do not. For us, the goal is less about resolving conflict than about understanding it, recognizing it, and democratizing it. We see democracy in the border zone as a fundamentally bottom-up process of exposing and rendering more accessible the complex histories and mechanisms of injustice that are too often hidden beneath official accounts of who we are. Racist political narratives in the United States portray the border as a site of rupture and criminality, but we are committed to generating different stories, counter narratives about life in this region, grounded in the experiences of those who inhabit it. We are a region of flows and circulation, shared practices and aspirations, alliances of hearts and minds, regardless of the wall that restricts the movement of our bodies. In this sense, the community stations are a cross-border observatory, a platform for constructing what we call an elastic civic identity from the bottom up, a kind of cross-border res publica. With our partners, we curate unwalling experiments, that build the wall, using visual tools like diagrams and radical cartographies to situate border neighborhoods within broader spatial ecologies of circulation and interdependence, from local to regional to continental and ultimately to global scales. We see elasticity as a sort of civics, the ability to stretch and return between local and more expansive ways of thinking over and again, to really understand one's own challenges within broader dynamics and processes, and to envision opportunities for solidarity and collective action. Here in the border region, the idea of the bioregion, the binational watershed system that Teddy introduced you to, has been a powerful imaginary for activating more elastic civic thinking. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border public action through one of the sewage drains that Homeland Security had carved into the wall between the Laurelus Canyon in Tijuana and the estuary on the US side that Teddy introduced you to earlier. We negotiated a permit with US Homeland Security to transform the drain into an official port of entry, southbound for 24 hours. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-description as just artists, as long as Mexican immigration was waiting on the southern side to stamp our passports. Our convoy was comprised of 300 local activists, residents, representatives from the municipalities of San Diego and Tijuana, and artists and border activists from around the world. We summoned people, agencies that are typically at odds with one another. And as we moved together southbound under the wall, we witnessed slum wastewater flowing northbound toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing from estuary to slum through a militarized culvert and the stamping of passports amplified the most profound interdependencies of our region. The great insight here, protecting the vulnerable US estuary demands shared investment in the informal Mexican settlement. So in this cultural experiment, we went down, but sometimes nurturing civic elasticity requires ascending of the familiar. In the early 20th century, Patrick Geddes designed the Camera Obscura in the center of Edinburgh, a 5-story observation tower that enabled people to look out across the region and comprehend the environmental systems that organize it. He coined the term regionalism. For Geddes, this was essential for constructing a civic identity and collective political will. Now, imagine a Mexican child standing on a narrow sliver of land along the eastern rim of the Laurelus Canyon, hundreds of feet of border wall, right here at a place called Mirador. Imagine she plants her feet facing due west with the expanse of the Pacific Ocean in front of her, Mexico to her left, the US to her right. Below to her immediate left, she sees the informal settlement where she lives. She can spot her house, her school, and experience their proximity to a country that she and her family are not permitted to enter. Below to her immediate right, almost beneath her feet, she sees the border wall that sort of, from this vantage, it looks like a sort of a flimsy and ridiculous strip that's inserted onto a vast and powerful natural system. Lifting her eyes, she sees the green expanse of the Tijuana River estuary with its vulnerable wetland habitats and sediment basins that are contrived to catch the northbound flows of waste from her community. And further beyond still, you can't see it in this photo, downtown San Diego, rising vertically into the sky. From this vantage, all the characters of this contested zone come to life. We've witnessed this moment of recognition again and again over the years among children, our students, policymakers, and even foundation presidents. There are few places on earth, we argue, where the collision of informality, militarization, environmental vulnerability, and the proximity of wealth and poverty can be so vividly experienced. But in reality, the conflicts that we experience here locally between nation and nature, right, are reproduced again and again along the entire trajectory of the continental border between the US and Mexico. Over the years, we've collected aerial photos like these that document precise moments where the jurisdictional line collides with natural systems, illustrating powerfully what dumb sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our Mexus project stretches our elastic civic aspirations to a continental scale. Mexus visualizes the entire border zone without the line. It dissolves the border into a bioregion whose shape is defined by the 8 binational watershed systems bisected by the international border. Mexus also exposes other systems and flows across this bioregional territory: tribal nations, protected lands, urban crossings, many more informal ones, 15 million people and more. Ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of belonging and cooperation beyond the nation state. Here it is in 2018 at the Venice Architecture Biennale. In Community Stations programming, Mexus, this image, becomes a powerful provocation for dialogue about a shared bioregional identity among Mexicans, Americans, and diverse tribal nations who inhabit this contested space. Now, the final civic stretch, literally, is a visualization project we call the Political Equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana, across the planet, forming a corridor of global conflict between the 30th and 38th parallels north. Along its trajectory lie some of the world's most contested and violent thresholds. The US-Mexico border at San Diego, Tijuana, the most trafficked international border checkpoint in the Western Hemisphere, over to, the Strait of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, the main route from North Africa into Fortress Europe. The Palestinian border that divides the Middle East, illegitimized by Israel's 50-year military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. India Kashmir, a site of intense and enduring territorial conflict between Pakistan and India since British partition. The border between North and South Korea, representing decades of intractable Cold War conflict, and China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea, along with Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, visualizing this political equator in red, alongside the climatic equator below in green, was an astonishing discovery for us, because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains our world's most populous slums, its sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export, and its zones of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, and human displacement. And when these parallel equators are applied to the Pierce quincunxial projection, from above, the Arctic becomes protagonist, with its melting ice caps detonating hemispheric conflict through sea level rise, coastal vulnerability, and human displacement. Really, in the end, collision, nationalism, climate catastrophe, and forced displacement is the global injustice trifecta of our time. But as we said at the beginning, these dynamics always hit the ground somewhere and are experienced by people locally in everyday places like ours and yours. Thank you so much.